Margaret, thank you very much for that. Very clearly expressed, and actually that proposition, 2 years professional practice experience as a minimum in a 7-year programme, will be the first motion to be voted on in about 30 minutes' time by councillors. In the meantime, I'm going to invite councillors who wish to make a comment and then throw it open to the wider audience. I have one councillor who's specifically asked to speak on this topic. Would Zaina James like to speak? And there are some roving microphones. Zaina, where are you?
I would agree with the last speaker. 2 years practical experience is undeniable. But from my personal experience, as I originally, long time ago, qualified in Bulgaria, then I worked in Austria, then I worked here, and then I worked in Brussels just when the first equalization of architectural education was thought in the 70s. From practical experience, I think that each European country is quite different in the way they practice, the way they follow their national heritage, their national architecture, the way their law of planning and building regulations exist. Each one, European countries, is very different, and it is one thing to talk about education, and it is another thing to talk about practical experience. And I just want to underline that each country of Europe is still very different in the way they perceive architecture, in the way they practice, and in the way architects are brought up to light. So it is extremely important, each country, to follow their practical experience. But when people, with the movement of people, change countries, they ought to have the practical experience of the country which they remain to practice. Like many years ago, I took part 3 here.
Thank you very much. Any other councillors who wish to contribute at this point? Yeah, there's 3 there on that side, and then you, sir. Let's take you first. Please tell everyone who you are.
I'm Ben Derbyshire. I support this motion as a starting point. Like many of the motions today, I think it is only a starting point, and I have one point of clarification about it, which seems to me to be important, which is to say, to ask, what is the significance of the 7-year period? Is it as if the 2 years have to be within 7 years, or would it be possible to qualify outside the 7-year period with 2 years PPE? It seems to me to be a minor but significant point.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask David Gloucester to comment on that, Director of Education. Rosbar might like to chip in as well, Vice President for Education.
No, certainly, whilst we consider that the framework might typically be 7 years, the whole point of today's debate really is to embrace the principles of difference, which is very much where the RIBA stands on architectural education. The concerns we basically have about introducing a credit structure that is flexible, the location of the PPE as being flexible, and within the general precepts of what in academia would be considered to be a level 7 award. So 7 years would be a typical model. It wouldn't invariably be the model.
Okay, yep, let's take another one. Tell us who you are.
Elspeth Clement, sorry, I'm a councillor. My point is that I support this motion, but it's missing something. And the last 3 speakers all touched on that, and that is assessment at the end of the professional training period. I believe if we're going to vote on this, we need to have that included. Or we need the alternatives of having it or not having it.
Thank you. David?
Absolutely. Every intention that the examination of professional competence will still be a prime part of the education of students of architecture.
Thank you. Let's take... I'm going to ask Roger Shrimpton to take that one on board and perhaps make a comment in a minute. The suggestion from the floor is that there needs to be an expression of assessment in the motion. But let's take another comment. Yes, please. Tell us who you are.
My name is Zolbena. I'm the Student Council member. I welcome the discussion today. I think it's very interesting. The model under discussion suggests a total of 7 years, 2 of which PPE, which currently I believe the system allows you to graduate within 7 years, as 12 of the 24 months of PEDRs could be actually taken during the duration of the Part 3 course. I'm really interested as a student gone through my education. I finished my Part 2 in July. So I'm interested to see the regulation management and unification of these 2 years of PPE. Flexibility and cost came up as words, but how do you see schools not taking advantage of extra charges for the professional, for the PPE supervision, which is actually happening at the moment under the PDR system, which doesn't seem to be unified across the country.
Thank you very much for that. We've got one here. Yes, please.
John Hickey, Councillor, North West Region. I would like to support the general approach of the motion, but would like to consider the issue that time, in years at least, is only one rather blunt measure of what the outcome should be. We have, as well, the possibility of considering credits, the criteria that are applied to those credits, and the outcome of the students' resource themselves. And I would look for some degree of flexibility in the way that those aspects are managed within the time constraints. In fact, from my point of view, I can see ways in which 7 years could be reduced, which would applaud, at least from my students, who feel that 7 years is an awful long time to be paying for and running through the process of getting, at the end of the day, a title which, for them at least, at the point when they enter the profession, is hardly relevant anymore. It is a title that is archaic. It's been with us since Soane almost, and it's not necessarily today's relevant approach. I support, therefore, John Asseel's recommendation and suggestion that we have in place a certificate to practice, which puts into position a competency at perhaps even a later stage than currently is proposed for the title itself. Nevertheless, that together with a redefinition of the title to make it more relevant to today's practice and the way things are actually happening on the ground, perhaps the end of the academic process is something that should be considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'll ask an international member of council at the front, in the front row here, to speak. Welcome, Dr. Goh Chong Chia.
I'm Goh Chong Chia, RIBA Council member from Singapore. I look at this recommendation and I tell myself, there's no change. This is exactly what RIBA has. So what are we debating this on? The other issue is, of course, what's the PPE? Is it to obtain RIBA Part 3? Or is it to register an architect in this country? Because obviously the registration is not RIBA based. It's another body. So there are actually two bodies. Is it to get a Part 3 or is it to get registration? I think the other point that I think is missing is that over the years, the profession has globalized. So what do we do with the level of practice if part of it is done overseas? I don't think there's any consideration of that at the moment in this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. One more councillor, George Oldham, and two more, and then I'm going to throw it open because I want the room to have a chance.
Councillor, I seek a point of clarification. Actually, I don't really want to vote on recommendation 1. I want to vote on recommendation 3, because I really have always believed, in a sense, that education is, to some extent, doesn't help the young. but I'll leave that for the moment, and I'd like to talk later on recommendation 3. But how does this work? If we vote for 1, do we exclude 3? If we, or what? No, we can continue. That's fine then. Because what I want to stress is I was taken by Flora's high-end concepts, and I think that's absolutely right. But you can get those from practice as well. In fact, when I was Director of Professional Practice in the University of Newcastle, we actually, after part 1, I actually went into every office that my students went into. And without exception, they all said they felt they had learned more from practice than they had from the previous 3 years. Now, that wasn't necessarily quite true. They were learning something different. But they were learning something which was hands-on, and they were learning something which they could feel that it wasn't masturbatory, that they made a difference. And I think that it's important that we look to options like recommendation 3. So as long as I can vote for recommendation 3, I can also vote for recommendation 2.
You may. None of this is mutually exclusive. There's a speaker behind you, and then I'll come to you there.
Hey, I'm Marie Braithwaite, student member of council. I'd just like to follow on from what was said about this doesn't challenge the current setup in the UK. And also we need to look at how this integrates with education, because the current system of a year out part 1 creates a deficit in the industry in that a lot of students don't continue to part 2 because they're just perpetuating debt accumulated at part 1. And also echo the thoughts on how the practical experience is really productive, because ultimately they're spending a year underpaid, sat in front of a computer, which is not productive to the industry, and there is more value to being on site and having true practical experience.
Thank you very much. Tell us who you are.
National representative. I'd just like to pick up on Elspeth's point and say that actually I disagree, and that if students can demonstrate professional competency through an integrated course, then there's no need to have an examination at the end if they've been awarded the credits partway through the process. And I hope that flexibility and that option is something that people really consider.
Thank you very much. I'm throwing it out. Is there anyone from the back who'd like to say anything? Because the purpose of an open meeting is for it to be open. Yes, please. There's a council member as well. I'm sorry. Tell us who you are.
Mark Benzie, I'm a council member. Just following on from some of the points raised, we're not actually doing anything with making this resolution that would challenge any flexibility in PPE. When I was a student, I worked in quite diverse. I worked for London Underground, I worked for the council, I worked overseas, and part of my problem with the PPE was it was very constrained. So I just want to make sure that in making this resolution, we're not inadvertently saying something about the experience that you have in those 2 years and confining it from, say, something that's equally valid and applicable to architecture.
Thank you very much. I will ask Ros Barr to make a comment after we've had a couple of other comments.